You don't always hear history arrive. Sometimes it smells. In a cold American winter, the smell was kerosene. Sharp, oily, promising light. Picture a small brick office on Euclid Avenue in Cleveland on January 10, 1870. 30 years old, ledger open, quiet hands. John Davison Rockefeller signs a paper that will do more than form a company. He sets a method in motion. Listen close to those first 2 minutes. A boy who sold candy by the piece, a ledger named Ledger A, a church hymn folded into a daily balance of pennies and prayers. This isn't an origin myth about a man born a titan. It's the quieter story. A meticulous clerk, a stubborn appetite for order, and a world desperate for light. Lamp oil for kitchens, fuel for lamps that pushed long nights away. The U.S. was changing. Rails knitting states, city streets brightening, industries asking for power. Edwin Drake's well in Pennsylvania had given the new age a name: oil. Drake struck crude in 1859. The question was not whether oil existed, but who would tame it. Where others sought chaos and price swings, Rockefeller smelled a system. He believed a market was just a machine that needed redesigning. He saw barrels, rails, tank farms, and, more importantly, the arithmetic of freight. Preferential railroad rates, secret rebates, were a hinge, and he would put his hand on it. This is where engineering meets ethics, when the efficient lever makes one man rich and many others vulnerable. When you turn that lever, who pays? In the first minutes of this story, you must feel two things: the thrill of craft and the cold edge of cost. Rockefeller's brilliance was forensic patience, counting costs to the last cent, organizing scarcity into storage, converting chaos into predictability. His ruthlessness, the willingness to buy and to outlast rivals, grew from that same quiet care for numbers. So, the lamp lights. Streets brighten across cities. Factories run later. Shipping quickens. But under that glow, something else shifts. Proprietors who once owned their refineries wake up to find their firms gone, bought for pennies, shuttered. Communities rearrange. The ledger multiplies into an empire. This story will walk you deeper, into his family rooms, into railway offices where rebates were whispered, and into newspaper columns that smelled of outrage. And it will ask you, through and through, the question people have been still asking since: when progress gathers power, who governs its conscience? John Davison Rockefeller's origin is not a simple moral tale. It's a household of contradictions. William Bill Rockefeller, a charming traveling salesman who sold remedies and sometimes trouble. Eliza Davison Rockefeller, a devout woman of thrift and prayer. Bill taught audacity and improvisation. Eliza taught accounting and restraint. John inherited both. As a child, John kept a ledger. He wrote down every cent. He tithed even when the pennies were scant. He learned mental arithmetic the way other boys learned hymnals. He was patient at chess, in negotiations, in waiting for the world to move so he could make it predictable. Bill's life was messy. Bigamous marriages, traveling medicine shows, arrests. For John, Bill's allure dimmed over time. He would later mark his father's character in silence, sometimes refusal. But Bill's practical cunning left a trace. The free recognition that rules had weak spots, and that people in motion left openings to be seized. Laura Spellman's presence steadied him. Their marriage in 1864 anchored domestic order. She would become the quiet partner in a household dedicated to measure and duty, and he would raise his children in strict patterns, chores recorded, money accounted for. They lived modestly even as wealth grew, not ostentation, but a devotion to the measure of things. This private life mattered publicly. Rockefeller did not want spectacle, he wanted systems. The ledger that started in a book at age 16 would scale to boardrooms, pipelines, and eventually to trusts. Yet the ledger was not only profit, it was moral arithmetic, tithes versus take.
He believed prosperity and piety could coexist, that faith demanded stewardship, not mere charity. That belief would shape the way he gave money back to the world, and how he defended the way he took it in. The family contradictions show us a central paradox, a man of prayer who would engineer unprecedented market power. To understand Rockefeller, you must hold both truths. The ledger and the hymn became the two instruments by which he measured success and justified means. That duality would open admirers' praise and critics' fury.
At 16, John D. Rockefeller took a job as a bookkeeper. Job day, he later called the day he began work at Hewitt & Tuttle. There is a marvel in someone who loves ledgers the way others love music. He took to detail the way a craftsman learns his tools, arriving early, leaving late, finding the beauty in a balanced account. He liked predictability. He learned how freight bills could be folded into price, how a barrel's cost multiplied across rails and docks. When he moved into refining with Samuel Andrews, Maurice Clark, and later Henry Flagler, he did not chase glamour. He tightened a machine. Barrels, staves, storage tanks, rail cars, each was a gear. Refining was an industry of accidents, fires, and wild margins. Kerosine's demand surged. Rockefeller's talent was not in romance, but in reduction. Reduce waste, cut costs, standardize. He set up his own barrel factories, invested in storage, negotiated access to rail lines. When competitors could not match the scale, he offered to buy them. When they refused, he applied pressure with price. Even the famous $72,500 bid at auction for the Excelsior refinery reads like ledger drama. $500 more than the rival Clark would pay, a small extra for a huge return. The Civil War's rearrangements of trade helped, too. Cleveland's bridges to Pennsylvania's fields gave him a logistical advantage. He pushed his financing hard, but he paid his debts on time, and bankers trusted him. Marriage to Laura did not soften that discipline, it reinforced it. She kept household order, he kept business order. The count of pennies at home resembled the tally of barrels at the yard. The private shaped strategy. Tithes to churches and charities alongside intense consolidation of refineries. Bookkeeping made him suspicious of inefficiency. It made him wary of unpredictability. That cautious, almost Puritan streak would be the engine of his rise and the source of later moral critique. January 10, 1870, Standard Oil is incorporated. Names on the papers: Rockefeller, Andrews, Flagler, William Rockefeller, Oliver Harkness, but the force was method. Standard was not a single refinery, it was a network, vertical integration to own supply and shipping, horizontal consolidation to control price and competition. The era that followed is called by some the Cleveland Massacre. Over months, Rockefeller moved to buy dozens of Cleveland refineries. He did not storm through with banners and threats. He executed a procedural takeover. He would buy old, inefficient plants, shut them, standardize the rest, coordinate rail shipments, and lower costs. For customers, kerosene prices could fall. For rivals, small proprietors, and local owners, entire livelihoods evaporated. The railroads were the hidden lever. Rockefeller used preferential rates and secret drawbacks to reduce cost per barrel. When the press later revealed this, Americans bristled. Hidden deals meant that the market's fairness had been undermined. For Standard, the math justified consolidation. For many, the moral calculus did not. The Cleveland moment shows how systems create winners and losers. There was efficacy to what Rockefeller did: stability of supply, predictable prices, the ability to meet growing demand. But the payoff for consumers carried a cost for American pluralism: local firms, local power, independence. The next chapters will show how that power grew until it touched politics, journalism, and law. If Standard built a machine, the railroad was its bloodline. In the early 1870s, railroads competed for freight. They offered rebates to secure volume. Rockefeller's team negotiated brilliantly. A 75% rebate from Cornelius Vanderbilt's network or a secret payback equaled a decisive edge. The South Improvement Company scheme, a proposed arrangement among railroads and select refiners, was a dagger wrapped in paper. It promised to raise rates broadly while selectively rewarding favored firms. News leaked, producers erupted in strikes, public anger mounted. Rockefeller responded by accelerating his buyouts. He used instability to expand. To Rockefeller, this was not merely favoritism, it was industrial design. Create predictable distribution, minimize friction, extract efficiency. To critics, it was manipulation and betrayal of market fairness. A key voice that crystallized public outrage was Ida Tarbell, a reporter who would later pursue the Standard story with relentless detail. But the rail story had already made the case that corporate practices mattered in the lives of ordinary people. This chapter's essence, technology and contracts can shape democracy. A hidden rebate changes more than price. It tilts power. Rockefeller built with those tilts, and the nation began to notice.
Ida Tarbell's series in McClure's magazine was not sensationalism. It was patient archive work. She traced contracts, followed freight papers, spoke with ruined proprietors, and showed how Standard's apparatus functioned in the granular certificates, secret rebates, shell companies. Journalism turned private deals into public scandal. Tarbell gave language to a growing anxiety. If a handful of men could shape entire markets with legal ingenuity, what then of democratic choice? Her reporting carried moral heat. These were not abstractionary numbers, but named men whose farms, refineries, and livelihoods vanished. The court of public opinion forced law into motion. State and federal suits began. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was a legislative attempt to name and restrain the danger of unchecked combinations. But law moves slowly. For decades, Standard would innovate around regulation. The story becomes legal chess. Trusts, holdings, corporate forms, each a countermove. Yet Tarbell did something else. She humanized consequence. Her portraits of ruined towns and angry men made the debate not simply about competition, but about civic fairness. Her work helped crystallize the argument that the market's invisible hand could not be assumed to shepherd the public good. As heat rose around Standard, John D. Rockefeller turned the energies of his wealth into institutions. He believed in systematic giving the same way he believed in systematic business. The University of Chicago, the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, and later the Rockefeller Foundation were not charity as alms. They were philanthropy as architecture. He funded public health campaigns, medical training, and educational institutions. He gave to schools for African Americans, Spelman, to research that fought disease, and to structural projects that outlasted politicians and markets. He wanted measurable outcomes, accountability, and long planning horizons. His philanthropy professionalized giving, hire experts, set targets, measure results. There was a strategy in this. Reputation, yes, but also belief in remedies. Rockefeller argued that institutions could fix social problems that profit alone could not. Critics argued that philanthropy could be a soft tool to shape public priorities that matched private interests. Both truths lie together. The transformation is real. Millions benefited from vaccines, scholarships, hospitals. But philanthropy also reframes power. Who decides what is a priority? Rockefeller's answer was technocratic and paternal in one breath. Standard did not stop at Cleveland. The company cast an eye overseas. Baku's fields, European markets, new pipelines. Oil became more than lamp fuel. It was lubricant for machines, fuel for ships, and soon enough, the gasoline that would power the automobile age. Standard systematized storage, certificates, and even rudimentary futures, converting stored oil into tradable claims. That financialization of energy made price manipulation harder to see and easier to manage. Rockefeller's enterprise became an engine of globalization. Yet with scale come rivals. Royal Dutch, Shell, Nobels in Baku, international players altered the map. Rockefeller adapted. He built offices in Europe, negotiated access. He accepted that monopoly in one country is a global chess piece. Energy became geopolitics. This thread matters now more than ever. Who controls energy shapes nations, wars, and economies. Rockefeller's early choices birthed a century in which access to energy would be a source of power and of conflict. Law finally caught up. The Sherman Antitrust Act was not a lightning strike, it was a legal drumbeat. After decades of scrutiny, suits, and committee hearings, the Supreme Court in 1911 ordered Standard Oil to dissolve. The trust split into many successor firms, names that would become household giants. Irony, the breakup made Rockefeller personally wealthier on paper. The dispersed companies, freed to trade independently, rose in value. The public felt a victory. Legal scholars cataloged a precedent. The economy adapted. But something else had changed. American law had announced a principle. Concentrated private power must be accountable. The case was not simply about money. It was about the limits of private scale in a republic. The decision carved a rule into the architecture of capitalism. Markets needed guardrails. Democracy needed transparency.
In private, John D. Rockefeller retreated to Pocantico Hills. He loved golf, reading ledgers, occasional travel. He had lost much in the market cycles and regained more in the corporate spin-offs. He watched his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., and later generations steer the family into philanthropy, city building, and civic projects like Rockefeller Center. Yet private life did not erase public grief. The family endured scandals, bribery allegations, labor conflicts like the Colorado mining strikes that stained their name. The philanthropic gifts could not wholly absolve the human costs of consolidation and labor suppression. What then is the moral ledger? If ledger A counted pennies and tithes, history counts hospitals and ruined mills together. The measure we take of John D. Rockefeller must hold both the cures and the wounds. The question for our time, with new giants and new platforms, is the same. How do we shape institutions so scale yields shared benefit rather than private domination? We have reached Chapter 10. The arc is set, from ledger to empire, from rebates to reform, from lamp oil to global energy. The chapters ahead will trace the family dynasty, the human costs at labor's front lines, the architecture of giving, the evolving legal doctrines, the ironic consolidation after breakup, and the final moral appraisal that turns Rockefeller's life into a mirror for our age. In 1911, the United States Supreme Court made its most resounding declaration yet about the limits of private power. Standard Oil of New Jersey versus United States ended with a verdict that struck like thunder across financial pages. Standard Oil was to be broken up. The ruling described the company's dominance as an unreasonable restraint of trade and ordered the empire divided into 34 separate companies. For a moment, it looked like the public had finally humbled John Davison Rockefeller. For decades, he had been portrayed in cartoons as a bloated figure with tentacles wrapped around Congress, the railroads, and even the White House. Farmers despised him. Small-town refineries cursed his name. Ida Tarbell had painted him as a calculating overlord who bent markets with his will. The Supreme Court ruling seemed the long-awaited justice. But here lies one of history's most profound ironies. The breakup of Standard Oil didn't impoverish Rockefeller. It did the opposite. Each of the 34 spin-off companies was valuable. Investors who once held Standard shares suddenly held stock in Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Amoco, and a constellation of oil companies that would dominate the 20th century. Freed from the drag of being a single trust, many of these firms' share prices soared. And who was the largest shareholder of Standard Oil at the time of the breakup? John D. Rockefeller himself. Almost overnight, the man whom the court had ruled against became wealthier than any American had ever been. Within a few years, his net worth passed $1 billion, making him the first billionaire in U.S. history. Newspapers declared his fortune unimaginable. His critics fumed. What kind of justice is this, that a man ruled guilty of monopoly becomes richer through his punishment? For Rockefeller, the irony was not bitter. He had already stepped back from day-to-day management. He lived quietly in retirement at Pocantico Hills, watching his fortune compound with the precision of his beloved ledgers. He claimed vindication. If the breakup gave America the appearance of competition while leaving him wealthier, Perhaps, he suggested, he had always been right. His efficiency and foresight had simply been too large for the legal world to contain. The public reaction was divided. Reformers celebrated the precedent. Trusts could be challenged, monopolies broken. But economists and businessmen marveled at the paradox. The remedy had enriched the very man it meant to humble. Rockefeller's name became less about oil and more about wealth itself, a byword for fortune so large it defied imagination. The lesson of 1911 is as relevant today as then. Law can rearrange corporate structures, but wealth has a way of reconstituting itself. A system designed for checks and balances may clip an empire's wings, but if the pieces remain profitable, the empire may simply scatter into new forms. Rockefeller, patient as ever, knew this. He did not rage against the court. He thanked it, quietly, for making him richer than any monarch of the old world. And so the breakup, intended as his downfall, became instead the final confirmation of his supremacy. It was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. The billionaire philanthropist, a man now free to test whether money, when given away, could purchase something larger than fortune. Redemption.
Long before the Supreme Court broke up Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller had begun to give. His first ledger, Ledger A, recorded nickels to his church and small gifts to the poor. But once his fortune swelled beyond precedent, giving became something else, a second career. He did not believe in charity as sentiment. He believed in charity as architecture. I believe it is a man's duty to make all the money he can and then to give all he can, he said. For Rockefeller, that did not mean alms to the beggar. It meant institutions that could re-engineer society itself. The University of Chicago was perhaps his boldest gift. He poured more than $30 million into its founding, a staggering sum in the 1890s, insisting that the institution be first-rate, global in ambition, modern in its rigor. The university rose from the marshlands of Hyde Park to become one of the nation's elite centers of learning. Scholars would train there, research would flourish, and Rockefeller's name would be stitched into the fabric of higher education. Then came medicine. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, founded in 1901, advanced vaccines, studied infectious disease, and professionalized medical training in America. Later, the Rockefeller Foundation, 1913, spread his influence worldwide, funding campaigns against hookworm in the American South, malaria abroad, and establishing schools of public health that continue to this day. But his giving was not only about scale, it was about method. Rockefeller demanded reports, measurable results, evidence that dollars produced outcomes. He brought the same obsession for efficiency that had built Standard Oil into his philanthropy. He treated giving like investment, demanding a return, not in profits, but in lives improved. Critics saw calculation. Was this redemption after decades of ruthless business practice? Was it reputation laundering, buying goodwill with dollars earned through monopoly? Some said yes, but the results were undeniable. Millions were treated for hookworm. Universities flourished. Medical breakthroughs saved lives. His gifts shaped whole fields of knowledge. He also gave to causes rooted in faith. He supported Baptist missions, funded churches, and supported Spelman Seminary, named for his wife's family, which became a premier institution for the education of African American women. By the 1910s, Rockefeller was giving away more than $500 million. In today's terms, tens of billions. Few men in history had ever transferred so much wealth from private hands to public institutions. And yet, the paradox remained. Could philanthropy cleanse the moral stain of monopoly? Could money, however generous, undo the lives crushed in the Cleveland massacre, the small refineries extinguished, the labor conflicts? Rockefeller never publicly confessed guilt. He insisted he had done right by the market and right by society. His giving, he said, was simply stewardship, his Christian duty. The world, however, remained divided. Some hailed him as the greatest benefactor in history. Others insisted no philanthropy could erase the cost of how the fortune was made. That question still shadows his legacy today. Wealth does not vanish when a man retires, it multiplies across generations. For the Rockefellers, John D's fortune became not just money, but a dynasty. His children, especially John D. Rockefeller Jr., would inherit not just billions, but the burden of a name synonymous with both power and controversy. John Jr. took the reins reluctantly. Unlike his father, he was not driven by ledgers and conquest. He believed in stewardship, in social responsibility. Yet he also presided over one of the darkest chapters in the Rockefeller story, the Colorado coal strikes of 1913 to 14, culminating in the Ludlow massacre. When miners in Rockefeller-controlled mines struck for better wages and safer conditions, company guards and state militia opened fire on a tent colony of strikers. Women and children were killed in the chaos. Newspapers across the nation screamed the headlines, "Rockefeller's soldiers slay miners." The family name, already tarred by monopoly, was now stained with blood. John Jr. responded with contrition. He visited the mines, spoke with workers, and brought in labor reformers to advise him. He tried to transform the family image from ruthless overlords to benevolent employers, but the damage lingered. Meanwhile, the family turned to other pursuits. The Rockefellers built Rockefeller Center in New York, a symbol of modern architecture and urban culture. They invested in conservation, funding national parks and land preservation. Later generations would move into politics. Nelson Rockefeller became governor of New York and vice president of the United States. J. Rockefeller became a U.S. senator from West Virginia. The dynasty spread into art, architecture, diplomacy. Their wealth gave them cultural power as much as financial. But with power came scrutiny. Every Rockefeller heir lived in the shadow of John D's paradox, benevolence built on ruthless foundations. Yet in their philanthropy, they magnified his model. The Rockefeller Foundation, still one of the world's most powerful charities, continued to fund global health, education, and the arts. The family name, while never scrubbed of controversy, became associated not only with oil, but with enduring civic influence.
To tell Rockefeller's story honestly, one must pause not in boardrooms or universities, but in the camps of workers. The laborers who laid pipelines, filled barrels, stoked refinery fires, dug coal for Rockefeller-owned companies. They carried the true cost. The oil industry was brutal. Explosions were common, burns disfiguring. Wages were low, hours long. Rockefeller rarely dealt directly with labor. He left that to managers. But his relentless demand for efficiency created pressures that cascaded downward. Every cut in cost was also a cut in someone's livelihood. The most notorious example remains the Ludlow massacre, but it was only the climax of decades of smaller conflicts. In Pennsylvania, Ohio, Colorado, miners and refiners organized strikes. Standards dominance meant fewer alternative employers. Workers had little leverage. Critics accused Rockefeller of hypocrisy, giving millions to hospitals while ignoring the injuries in his own plants. His defenders argued he could not micromanage every site, that philanthropy had broader scope. The truth is complex. He lived in an age when labor rights were embryonic, when violence at strikes was not rare. Yet his wealth made him the target of special outrage. Newspapers carried caricatures of Rockefeller handing out dimes to children while his companies crushed miners' unions. The dime, in fact, became a symbol. Late in life, Rockefeller enjoyed handing out shiny new dimes to children he met. To him, it was a token of cheer. To critics, it was a cruel reminder of a fortune built on others' hardship. The workers' cost remains the undercurrent of his story. For every grand library, there was a family struggling on meager wages. For every medical breakthrough funded, there was a miner's lung never treated. History cannot ignore the contradiction.
By the 1920s, John D. Rockefeller was no longer the titan of business. He had become an old man in retirement, golf clubs in hand, strolling the grounds of his estate at Pocantico Hills. He lived modestly by billionaire standards, no royal courts, no garish displays. He favored simple meals, early bedtimes, long walks. Reporters occasionally caught glimpses of him, thin and bald, handing out dimes to children, smiling in photographs. He became almost a caricature of grandfatherly wealth. But behind that smile was a mind still calculating, still exacting. He tracked his philanthropy with the same rigor as his early ledgers. He demanded reports, outcomes, efficiency. He lived to see the Great Depression, to watch fortunes vanish overnight, while his remained secure. He had lost heavily in the crash of 1929, but the structure of his holdings and his diversified wealth meant resilience. He lived to see oil power automobiles, aircraft, and industry. He lived to see his foundation tackle global disease. On May 23, 1937, at the age of 97, John Davidson Rockefeller died. He had lived long enough to see his fortune surpass imagination, his philanthropy reshape institutions, and his name become both infamous and admired. At his funeral, America looked upon a paradox. Here lay a man who had once been called the most hated in the country, now also celebrated as its greatest benefactor. The obelisk at Lakeview Cemetery stands not only over his grave, but over the enduring debate: can greatness built on ruthless efficiency be redeemed by generosity? The twilight of Rockefeller's life was not about conquest, it was about legacy. And legacy, as history shows, is not what you declare, it is what people remember, argue about, forgive, and never forget. Rockefeller's genius was never only about barrels or rebates. It was about structure. Where other men saw chaos, he saw a system waiting to be organized. That instinct carried into his philanthropy. By the early 1900s, he no longer thought of himself as merely wealthy. He thought of himself as a steward, entrusted to re-engineer society itself through calculated giving. The Rockefeller Foundation, chartered in 1913, became the ultimate expression of that instinct. Unlike the scattered charity of earlier millionaires, this was giving as enterprise. Rockefeller believed that society's deepest problems, disease, ignorance, poverty, could be attacked with the same methods that had conquered the oil market: integration, efficiency, accountability. Hookworm was one of his first targets. In the American South, hundreds of thousands suffered from lethargy and chronic illness caused by the parasite. Rockefeller poured millions into a campaign that combined medical treatment, public education, and sanitation reform. The results were staggering. Entire communities revived. Productivity rose. Critics who once called him a robber baron were forced to reckon with healthier children in schools, stronger men in fields, women able to work without fatigue. From there, his giving turned global. The Rockefeller Foundation funded campaigns against yellow fever and malaria, supported schools of public health at Johns Hopkins and Harvard, and invested in medical research that would later help unlock cures for meningitis and vaccines that saved millions. But it wasn't just medicine. Rockefeller also believed education was the keystone of democracy. He gave heavily to the University of Chicago, shaping it into a powerhouse of scholarship. He funded black education in the South through the General Education Board. He poured money into libraries, agricultural reform, and arts institutions. What made his giving revolutionary was not just the scale, but the method. He demanded reports. He wanted measurable outcomes. He hired experts, scientists, educators, physicians to administer programs rather than relying on sentiment or political influence. It was philanthropy professionalized, philanthropy that thought in decades, not weeks. And yet the paradox remained. Was this redemption, or was it control? Critics warned that by shaping universities and medicine, Rockefeller was also shaping the priorities of entire societies. Whose vision of the public good was being imposed? Was it democracy, or was it benevolent oligarchy? Rockefeller brushed these critiques aside. He believed God had blessed him with wealth, and his duty was to give it back in ways that multiplied benefit. To him, philanthropy was not apology, it was obligation. He never admitted wrongdoing in his business practices, but he poured his later years into proving that money,
properly directed, could heal as much as it had once dominated. In the science of giving, Rockefeller found his twilight obsession. If Standard Oil had conquered energy, the Rockefeller Foundation would attempt to conquer ignorance and disease. It was, in its way, a second empire, an empire of goodwill, and like the first, it was built on structure, control, and relentless order.
By the early 20th century, Rockefeller's reach extended far beyond the borders of the United States. His fortune had become global capital, his philanthropy, international infrastructure. What began in Cleveland refinery has now touched villages in Asia, universities in Europe, and laboratories on every continent. Standard Oil itself had pioneered the globalization of energy. Offices in London, agents in Paris, tankers steaming across oceans. Rockefeller's machine had made kerosene and petroleum staples of the modern world. Farmers in India lit Rockefeller's kerosene lamps. Ships in the Pacific fueled with Standard's oil. The very fabric of globalization carried his imprint. After the breakup, the successor companies only expanded that influence. Exxon, Mobil, Chevron. The pieces of the empire became engines of 20th century geopolitics. Wars would be fought, treaties signed, alliances shifted, all with oil at their center. Rockefeller, though retired, had laid the groundwork. He had transformed oil from a regional curiosity into the bloodstream of industrial civilization. His philanthropy followed the same trajectory. The Rockefeller Foundation dispatched teams abroad to fight disease, to study agriculture, to seed new institutions. It helped build the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. It sent experts to China, Latin America, and Africa. In some places, Rockefeller's money was the first significant investment in public health ever seen. But here, too, the paradox of power emerged. In reshaping global health priorities, the foundation sometimes imposed American models on local realities. Critics accused it of paternalism, of assuming that Rockefeller's vision of progress was universal. The image of the billionaire's hand reaching into foreign villages was not always welcomed. But for millions, the results were undeniable. Death rates fell, diseases retreated, agricultural yields rose with Rockefeller-funded research. Where governments faltered, the foundation filled gaps. John D. Rockefeller himself rarely traveled abroad, but his money did. It carried his name into corners of the globe he never saw. In a way, he became a global figure without leaving home. His ledger, once a boy's notebook of pennies, had become a planet's budget of progress. The global stage is where Rockefeller's legacy becomes most haunting. He built systems that both liberated and constrained, that cured diseases while entrenching a kind of philanthropic imperialism. His reach was vast, his impact undeniable, his intentions a blend of faith, ambition, and order. The world itself became, in a sense, Rockefeller's refinery, chaos distilled into efficiency, suffering met with systemic relief. In the strange theater of American opinion, Rockefeller occupied two stages at once. On one, he was the villain, the archetypal robber baron, his bald head and piercing eyes sketched in newspapers as the very embodiment of greed. On the other, he was the benefactor, the man whose gifts had built universities, cured diseases, and modernized public health. Which was the real Rockefeller? In 1902, when Ida Tarbell's History of the Standard Oil Company began appearing, the public devoured every detail of his alleged ruthlessness. She described how he crushed rivals, manipulated railroads, bought legislators, and concealed deals behind shells of legality. Her portrait was devastating, and it stuck. For decades, Rockefeller was reviled as the symbol of monopoly's corruption. But by the 1920s and 1930s, another portrait emerged. Headlines celebrated his philanthropy. Pictures showed him smiling benignly, handing dimes to children. The very man who had once been painted as a tentacled monster was now portrayed as America's kindly grandfather. Both images were true, and neither told the whole story. Rockefeller was ruthless in business, uncompromising,
cold, willing to let rivals fall. And he was devoutly generous in philanthropy, methodical, visionary, determined to heal. He embodied the contradiction of capitalism itself. The same system that concentrates power also generates the wealth that funds progress. The public struggled with that contradiction. Could one forgive the fortune's origins if its fruits were universities and vaccines? Could philanthropy cleanse the stain of monopoly? Could America both despise and admire the same man? Rockefeller himself seemed unfazed. He rarely gave interviews, rarely defended himself publicly. He let the caricatures wash over him, retreating into golf, prayer, and philanthropy. To him, the truth was simple. He had done what the market allowed, and he was now doing what his conscience demanded. But for America, he became a symbol. To some, he was the proof that unchecked wealth corrupts democracy. To others, he was the proof that wealth once accumulated could redeem itself in service to humanity. The tension between public enemy and public benefactor would define not only Rockefeller, but every titan who followed.
History never leaves Rockefeller alone. Decades after his death, scholars still argue over the meaning of his life. Was he the ruthless monopolist who crushed competition and bent the republic to his will? Or was he the visionary capitalist who stabilized the chaotic market and pioneered modern philanthropy? Ida Tarbell's judgment was clear. Rockefeller was a manipulator who betrayed the spirit of fair play. Progressive reformers of her era agreed, seeing in him the danger of concentrated corporate power. But later economists would point to Standard Oil's achievements: lower kerosene prices, higher efficiency, a reliable product that lit millions of homes at affordable cost. Consumers in the end benefited. Then came the philanthropic historians, who emphasized his role in creating the modern university, advancing medicine, and seeding global health. They argued that no man in history had redirected more private wealth into public good. The debate is not simply academic. It shapes how we think about capitalism itself. Do we measure a system by the harshness of its methods or the benefits of its outcomes? Do we condemn the concentration of power, even if consumers gain? Do we celebrate philanthropy, even if it comes from fortunes built in ruthless ways? Rockefeller forces us into complexity. His life is not a morality play with easy villains and heroes. It is a parable of contradictions. He was both the cold-eyed monopolist and the devout Baptist donor. He was both destroyer of small businesses and builder of global institutions. Historians now often conclude with nuance. Rockefeller was neither devil nor saint, but the embodiment of the Gilded Age's tensions. He shows us the perils of unregulated power and the possibilities of directed wealth. He is a caution and a model, a shadow and a light. The debate will not end, because the questions he raises are perennial. Every new age of concentrated wealth, from railroads to tech giants, finds itself measured against the Rockefeller paradox. And perhaps that is his truest legacy, not an answer, but a question that each generation must face anew. If Rockefeller's life feels distant, it is only in costume. The questions he embodied are alive today. In his era, the tool was oil. In ours, it is data, algorithms, platforms. But the pattern is the same. One man's efficiency becomes another man's monopoly. One company's scale becomes society's dilemma. Rockefeller's rebates are today's preferential algorithms. His pipelines are today's broadband networks. His trust structure is today's conglomerate. The parallels are uncanny. What do we learn from his story? First, that law always lags technology. Standard Oil grew faster than legislators could react. By the time Ida Tarbell and the Supreme Court intervened, Rockefeller's empire had already transformed America. The lesson is clear. Democratic oversight must move faster than it did then. Second, that efficiency can coexist with injustice. Rockefeller lowered kerosene prices for millions, but devastated small towns and workers. We must ask not only what consumers gain, but what communities lose. Third, that philanthropy, while powerful, is no substitute for fairness. Rockefeller's hospitals and universities were blessings, but they did not erase the strikes, the ruined businesses, the blood at Ludlow.
Philanthropy cannot be a repair kit for systemic imbalance. It must be coupled with just rules from the start. And finally, that legacy is complex. Rockefeller was hated, then admired, then debated. His story warns us against simple labels. We must hold contradiction in our understanding of power. When we look at today's titans, tech barons, global financiers, we should remember the kerosene lamps of Rockefeller's day. They lit homes, yes, but they also lit shadows. The real question is not whether we will produce new Rockefellers. It is whether we will be wise enough to balance their brilliance with boundaries, their gifts with accountability. That is the enduring lesson of America's first billionaire, the need to see both the light and the shadow, and to decide what kind of illumination we truly want for the future.
By the 1920s, John D. Rockefeller was no longer the titan who walked through Wall Street offices with fire in his eyes. He was an old man, stooped, his bald head shining under the summer sun at his estate in Pocantico Hills. Yet even in retreat, he was not forgotten. He had become a figure of public fascination, part curiosity, part legend, part cautionary tale. He lived simply in those years. Golf became his favorite ritual. He was said to rise early, pray, take walks through the manicured grounds, and delight in small pleasures. He liked handing dimes to children, a gesture that became both a joke and a symbol. What did it mean? The richest man alive giving away 10 cents at a time. To some, it was mockery, to others, humility. To Rockefeller himself, it was habit, a reminder that money had weight no matter the amount. He was cautious with his health. Diets of simple foods, early bedtimes, and rigid routines kept him alive long past most men of his generation. Newspapers marveled that the once despised magnate had outlived nearly all his rivals. Carnegie was gone. Morgan was gone. Gould and Harriman were memories. Rockefeller lingered, a relic of the Gilded Age, now sitting quietly in the modern world of radios and automobiles. Yet even in quiet, he wielded influence. He followed the work of his foundation, receiving reports, asking questions, guiding priorities. He watched America lurch into the Roaring '20s, then collapse in the Great Depression. He read about strikes, market crashes, and new tycoons rising in industries he had never touched. And through it all, his presence was paradoxical. Here was a man whose name once struck fear into senators, now passing coins to delighted children. Here was the robber baron, now appearing in photographs as a kindly grandfather. Public memory had shifted, and so had the man himself. The twilight years were not about building new empires, but about watching the echoes of old ones. Rockefeller lived long enough to see himself transformed in the American imagination, from villain to curiosity to benefactor. He had become, in his own words, an old man who has had his day. But in truth, his day had not ended. His shadow still stretched across the economy, philanthropy, and the very soul of capitalism. Twilight is not the absence of light. It is the long, strange glow after the sun has set. On May 23, 1937, in the quiet of his Florida estate, John D. Rockefeller took his final breath. He was 97 years old. In that instant, America lost not just a man, but a symbol. The first billionaire, the empire builder, the philanthropist whose name had become shorthand for wealth itself. The news spread like wildfire. Newspapers printed long obituaries that struggled to capture his contradictions. Some praised his genius, others condemned his ruthlessness. Headlines called him the richest man in modern history, a builder of universities, a slayer of competition, a paradox in flesh. Funeral crowds gathered, though Rockefeller himself had asked for simplicity. There were no grand state ceremonies, no monuments of marble. Just family, close associates, and the quiet prayers of the Baptist faith he'd carried since boyhood. The man who had dominated Wall Street, outlasted presidents, and changed the global economy was laid into the ground as humbly as any clerk or farmer. But his absence was felt instantly.
His companies, Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, marched on, reshaping the world's dependence on oil. His foundation continued funding projects in science and education. His name lived in universities, in medical breakthroughs, in every corner of philanthropy where the Rockefeller gift had planted roots. For ordinary Americans, his death was unsettling. He had been alive so long, through so many transformations of the nation, that his passing felt like the closing of a century. He was born before railroads spanned the continent, and he died as planes crossed oceans. He had seen slavery abolished, 2 presidents assassinated, the rise of skyscrapers, the crash of markets. And in that coffin lay not just a man, but an age. And as America lowered him into the earth, it confronted the reality of what he left behind. An empire without an emperor, a legacy without resolution, a fortune that would ripple across generations.
After Rockefeller's death, his fortune, carefully planned, meticulously managed, became one of the most enduring legacies of private wealth in human history. The Rockefeller Foundation continued to grow, funding research that would revolutionize medicine. It supported the development of penicillin, the eradication of hookworm, the green revolution in agriculture that helped feed billions. In laboratories and classrooms, his money shaped the 20th century as profoundly as his oil had shaped the 19th. The family itself became a dynasty. His children and grandchildren managed not only the fortune, but the family's public image. The Rockefellers became synonymous with philanthropy, politics, and social leadership. Nelson Rockefeller would rise to become governor of New York State and vice president of the United States. Others would fund museums, conservation efforts, and global initiatives. Yet the fortune also carried weight. The Rockefeller name was never neutral. It invoked admiration and suspicion alike. Was the dynasty proof that private wealth could serve the public, or proof that money bought power across generations? Still, the sheer scale of the legacy was undeniable. No individual in history had redirected so much private wealth into such public institutions. The University of Chicago, Rockefeller University, the Rockefeller Foundation, all stood as monuments, not of stone, but of endowments, shaping minds and curing diseases long after the man was gone. The fortune's legacy was a reminder. Wealth outlives the hands that hold it. Rockefeller's billions became rivers flowing into the future, their channels carved by choices he had made decades before. It is easy to lose John D. Rockefeller in the caricatures, the octopus monopolist, the kindly old man with dimes, the first billionaire. But beneath the legend was a human being, driven by fear, faith, and obsession. He was born poor, with a father who was a con man and a mother who instilled strict piety. That childhood left him with a hunger for security, a distrust of chaos, and a belief that money was both shield and proof of virtue. His obsession with order, the ledgers, the systems, the trusts, was not just business acumen. It was an attempt to control a world that had once been precarious and unreliable. His faith was real. He prayed daily, tithed to his church, and believed his fortune was divine stewardship. He did not see himself as greedy. He saw himself as disciplined, as fulfilling God's plan. The contradictions between ruthless tactics and devout prayer lived side by side in him, never reconciled but never abandoned. And then there was his humanity in small things, his love of golf, his delight in children, his joy in music. He laughed, he told stories, he carried the weight of being misunderstood but rarely defended himself. He was, in the end, a man shaped by the same forces that shape us all: family, faith, fear, and ambition. Seeing the human beneath the legend matters. It reminds us that titans are not gods. They are flawed men whose strengths and weaknesses, magnified by fortune, ripple outward across history. Rockefeller was neither monster nor saint. He was a man. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all. As the story of John D. Rockefeller closes, we are left with more questions than answers. What does it mean to live a life of such extremes? To be hated and admired, feared and revered, cursed and blessed? His empire built the modern energy economy, but it also crushed competitors. His philanthropy healed millions, but it also concentrated influence. His faith guided him, but it also justified his excess. His legacy is contradiction, written in stone and flesh. And yet, in the contradictions lies the lesson. Rockefeller forces us to look at wealth and ask, what is it for? Is it for domination or for stewardship? Is it for self or for society? Is it curse or is it a gift? The ending of his story is not really an ending. It is a mirror held up to every age of concentrated power. In our time, as new billionaires rise in technology and finance, the Rockefeller question returns. How will we judge them? How will they judge themselves? Will they, like him, seek redemption in philanthropy? Or will they, unlike him, find new ways to balance ambition with justice from the start? As viewers, as citizens, as humans, we are left with both sympathy and unease. Sympathy for the boy who wanted security, for the man who prayed earnestly, for the elder who gave dimes with a smile. Unease for the empire that bent markets, for the monopoly that strangled rivals, for the wealth that skewed democracy. In the end, to understand Rockefeller is to understand ourselves, the shadows and the light of human ambition, and perhaps to forgive him a little, to admire him a little, and above all, to love the humanity even in a man who became more symbol than flesh. His story is not simply about oil or money or power. It is about what we do with the lives we are given, and that is a question that belongs to us all.